Yes, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very glad to introduce this very special meeting with Amitav Ghosh. As you know, because it's very popular here in Italy and elsewhere in the world, is a leading figure in the, not only in the literature but also in the contemporary thinking about the world. Social and environmental issues, and of course, especially how land and water get together. The latest book is really great, a great example of how a story can become a learning and a reflection about the contemporary world. So. Thank you, Mr. Gosh, for getting to us.
Thank you, Duilio. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So I know you are based in New York. You are talking from New York right now, aren't you?
No, actually, I'm in Virginia right now.
Yeah.
I was in New York through most of the lockdown, but I came here last week, in fact.
Great, great. And of course, our special meeting is will be focusing, especially from your point of view, on how environmental issue meets culture and especially literature. You have spoken a few times, at least, very often, let's say, about this, and you also one of the questions which I wanted to start with is why literature and culture it's so let's say sometimes distant from what is from the environmental issues and environmental sensitiveness.
Yes, that's a very important question and a very pressing question in our times. And I've written about this issue at some length in my book La Grande, cecità, in Italian.
Yes, the great derangement.
The great derangement, yes. I think there are any number of reasons, really. One is that, most culture is produced by people who live in cities, Mm-hmm. They don't actually feel the effects of climate change as directly as people elsewhere. But at the same time, the real question is that there are many people, many artists, many writers who are directly affected by climate change. Take, for example, New York City. New York City was hit by Hurricane Sandy, which was a climate aggravated event, we might say. And yet, New York City is filled with writers, with artists, with poets. But have you heard of any major novels about Hurricane Sandy, or have you seen any paintings of Hurricane Sandy or anything related to that? It's really difficult to know why there's such a kind of blindness to these issues. But at the same time, I must say that I think things are changing. Especially since 2018, I think 2018 was somehow an inflection point. After that, I've noticed that there's a lot more work coming out around climate change in literature, in art. In Venice, you will have seen that astonishing sculpture by Anthony Quinn's son, I'm forgetting his name, but of a hand reaching out of the water. It's a very powerful image, I think.
Yeah. And Mr. Gosh, you think that all this might have slightly changed because of the pandemic? I mean, has the pandemic created a better, let's say, better ground for sensitiveness about environmental issues in our cultural world, let's say?
It's too early to say, I think. It's hard to say. Here in America, certainly the pandemic has created an enormous sort of social upheaval, as you must know, with the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. Yeah. These are now the biggest demonstrations ever seen in America. Apparently 26 million people have taken part in them. And I think it has created some kind of greater awareness also of climate-related issues. Because, increasingly one sees activists who are out there saying uh, social justice is also climate justice, that we have to take, you can't address social justice issues without attending to environmental justice, because, often in the United States and elsewhere, it's the poor who pay the price of climate change.
Yeah. Let's go back to the
I'm
say
sorry.
social and contemporary and sorry, just going back to the contemporary, let's say, scene. Is the economy, is the economy what is the economy of, what's the role of the economy when you go to the pandemic question, and of course to all this, let's say, environmental issues matters? You see any change? You see any increase in sensitiveness from that part of the contemporary society?
Well, I find it interesting, certainly, that there seems to be a lot of rethinking, especially within the fashion industry.
Yeah.
I've been seeing a lot of stuff coming out from there where many major designers are really asking very important questions. And I think this is very true, especially of Italian designers. You know, in these last 10, 15 years, or let's say the last 20 years, the years of neoliberalism, we've been living in a kind of manic, crazy world, you know, everything going faster and faster. Do you know that the average number of times that a new garment is used nowadays is 6? After 6 uses, most garments are thrown away.
Wow.
It's
What they call fast
unbelievable.
fashion. Yes.
Yes. I mean,
Very
the
fast fashion.
disposability, it's just, I mean, it's just mind-boggling, really,
Yeah.
Uh, and obviously, these things have to be answered because, once upon a time, people could actually send used clothes somewhere. I read somewhere recently that there is no use for used clothes. Nobody accepts used clothes. So it's not just a question of, fashion consumers. Even amongst the poor, no one accepts used clothes anymore. So clearly, these things have to change. I mean, I grew up in a world where, uh, people treasured clothes that had been worn over generations. Saris, for example, they were worn generation after generation. Dhotis, which men wear, were worn generation. I mean, I have so many clothes that I inherited from my father and that I'm really proud to wear. But all of that, in today's world, I see with my children, they just run into a shop, pick up a whole bunch of stuff, and run out. It has no meaning. Buying clothes in that way.
Yeah. Um, as you might know, I'm a broadcaster. I'm a journalist. I'm a producer of documentary, and also I've been into news business for very long time of my career. So I have been I've been going through a few times about these matters, environmental issues, all these questions, and I've realized all the time, that talking about those things to the wide audience of let's say of a TV broadcaster or mainstream, it could be quite difficult as well, even for media people, is that is that the same problem that the culture face when they do not talk properly about those questions? Do you think there is a similar problem with media?
Of course, but it's not just the media. And I think you can't even really just blame the media because, there have been studies done that
Mm.
show that the quickest way to bring a dinner party to an end is to mention climate change,
Mm.
or environmental issues. I mean, people just don't want to think about these things, I mean, and I've seen this myself. I mean, when I started writing about climate issues and so on, many of my friends would say, why are you bothering with this? What's the point?
Mhm.
And especially you as a writer, why are you bothering? So I think we have to accept that this is a systematic thing, that people in the world just don't want to pay attention. And also, again, I would say that this is also a part of a kind of this neoliberal mindset. You know,
Mhm.
you just want to think about what you can consume, and culture has become all about consumption. You know, you buy more and more. I mean, you just look at the way that novels are written. In novels now, consumption has become so much embedded that if you want to write about a character, you basically describe what they consume, you know. And that has been happening in especially American writing for the last, I would say 50 years.
Yeah. Um, let's open the door of in the United States, Mr. Gosh. I mean, we have the feeling that Mr. Trump has been, one of the issues, concerning not only the pandemic right now, but let's say a vision of the environmental issue which took back, let's say, the world, or at least the United States, for they put back the timing, and all the environmental issues were put back in the shelf. Why is that?
You know, Mr. Trump has obviously been a disaster for environmental issues. You know, I mean, I mean, how can we even say, I mean, how great a disaster he has been? But on the other hand, I think he's also made certain things clear, and I think there is something to learn from that clarity.
Hmm.
What he's made clear is actually a sort of assumption on which the global leadership operates, which is that the people who will suffer from climate breakdown will mainly be poor people.
Hmm.
You know, there will be people in poor countries, and there'll be the poor people in rich countries. So basically, what they're saying to us is that we are not going to do anything about climate change because the poor will pay the cost. You know, that's exactly, I mean, that's what they're saying. And in America, that has also been the message of the pandemic. You know, the reason that they've opened up like this is because they feel that the cost will be borne mainly by the poor. But we can see that in both instances, this is a tragic misunderstanding of the situation. You know, in America, it's not just the poor who are paying the price of the pandemic. You know, it's the entire economy that's paying the price of the pandemic. Similarly, it can be shown that even in regards to climate change, it's not just the poor who are paying the price of climate change. You take these terrible Hurricane Harvey, which hit Houston, some years ago.
Yeah.
Houston is one of the richest cities in the world. It was devastated. You know, you take California, the wildfires. The wildfires have affected the rich as well. You take southeastern Australia. You know, that's also been devastated by wildfires. In fact, I would say that in many ways, rich countries are being hurt by climate change at an even greater extent than poor countries in many cases. So this narrative is a mistaken narrative, but they believe it. The world's leaders believe it, and that's why they cannot say it openly, but their actions indicate that this is what they're doing. They're letting the world. They're letting climate change run rampant because they think that they will not pay a price.
Yeah. There is a book which reminds me very much of the things which we are talking about. I believe in English is can you help me out with the goddess, what the goddess the merchant are? Yeah, it's like the original title is Island of Guns.
Gun Island. Ah, yes, my book. Okay, Gun Island. I'm sorry, I didn't.
I'm sorry.
About
Gun Island.
Yeah.
It's a great book, not only because it's a great literature, but also it depicts the character which represent, if I'm not wrong, the profit represented by the merchant and the nature represented by goddess, and the dialogue among those two things creates the narrative.
Yeah.
Yes. So who is winning finally in your opinion? I mean, is there any assumption which we can come across after reading your book?
Well, that legend on which this book is based is a very old legend from my part of the country, from Bengal. It goes back a millennia.
Mm.
And when I started reading this legend, what really struck me is that it went straight to the heart of the contemporary dilemma, which is how do you balance the needs of other beings, and how do you balance the human urge towards profit and destructiveness. And it's interesting to me that this idea was so clearly understood, thousands of years ago by ordinary people, that if you let humans run rampant in this way, then all other beings are going to be silenced. And that is essentially what this whole neoliberal economy has done. It's just completely silenced all other beings, all other forms of consciousness, and replaced them with this incredibly destructive mode of existence. How do we get away from it now? We have to think. You just take the example, one example which I take in this book. Santa Maria della Salute.
Yes.
Italy has had terrible epidemics before, and Santa Maria della Salute actually commemorates one such epidemic.
Yes.
Do you think Italy's had some terrible climate catastrophes in these last few years? You remember that terrible flood that happened in Genoa?
Yes.
It swept away so many people. Have you seen any memorials to that? It's so strange. I mean, people, they just forget these events in these weird ways. I think in many ways, one of the countries that is most affected by climate change is Italy.
Yes.
Again, it's so little spoken of. I mean, Sicily is basically becoming a part of the Sahara. With these extended droughts, with these, people can't produce, lemons and oranges anymore. There are cities that have no supply of water for many days in the week, and yet, how often do people write about this? And
yeah, and how is that this removal, let's say, the social removal of this? Why is that? Because we all want to to forget about bad things, or something else?
Well, again, as I said, this is not, this is often presented as a historical, as a sort of human trait or whatever, but it's not a human trait. Humans have in the past thought very carefully about these issues. Humans have realized that, they're very vulnerable, that they're very fragile, that they need to plan for the future, that they need to protect themselves. I think what has really happened, is that modernity has given the modern human a sense of mastery, a sense that they're invulnerable. And this started very early. You remember the great Lisbon earthquake of 1755, and what a powerful effect it had on Voltaire and many other, thinkers of the Enlightenment, because they thought that they had conquered nature, and suddenly nature was hitting back in ways that they couldn't understand or grasp or comprehend. And they thought that, what is this? We thought that we finally got a handle on everything, and suddenly it's out of control. So my hope for this pandemic is really that, people regain a sense of fragility, a sense of vulnerability, and come to understand that, human society is not the story of triumphal progress.
Yeah, it's interesting that you speak about Italy, about pandemics, because we have we just went back to the old times, and we discovered that the word quarantine was invented by the Venetian when they discovered and they put in relation the pandemic and the fact that they might have some latency in the appearing of the illness. So we using those those times of the lockdown, we learned a lot about our past, and it's true, we went through very, very hard events, as you said. I just wanted to ask you something about science versus spirituality. I mean, we have the feeling that science can help us out, but sometimes science brings us towards, let's say, industry, towards, let's say, consumption, or towards new, way of behaving, but not always very, let's say, not always very, efficient. Is there a conflict between these two, or they can talk among those two worlds?
See, science can tell us a lot about the phenomenal world. And that's why science is very, very important, especially in these moments of crisis, in regard to climate change, in regard to pandemics and so on. But, we also have to recognize that, especially in relation to climate change and in relation to this acceleration that we are seeing in the world, that this is also a crisis of culture. It's a crisis of this culture of consumption, of continuous acceleration, and fundamentally, it's a crisis of meaning. What do we humans find meaning in? And, the contemporary human finds meaning in consumption, So science can do a lot to tell us about how we can fix things, how we can change things, but scientists can't address questions of meaning. That's not their job. They really cannot do that. We can't expect them to do that. And that's where we, as producers of culture, have failed, because we should be the ones who are trying to create some kind of meaning in the world. That's our job. And we haven't been able to do it. And that's the reason why, this entire culture of consumerism has just taken us in its grip. Fundamentally, climate change as well as the pandemic and so on, they all have their roots in the same thing, which is this acceleration. The acceleration of the economy, the acceleration of production, the acceleration of consumption. And all of it is driven ultimately by our desires. And these desires ultimately are rooted in culture and in forms of meaning. And that way, I must say, I really feel so often that, the only real leader in the world today is Pope Francis, who constantly addresses this question of meaning and who keeps pointing out, to the terrible lack of meaning at the heart of the modern predicament.
And it's true. Pope Francis has been addressing this issue since long time, since the beginning of his mandate. Just as you know, we are part of a special events called Rivestiti 2020, and it's a special event which concerns fashion and especially fair trade in fashion. Fair attitude. Of course. Do you believe fair trade could be even a slight response to this kind of acceleration of consumption and everything?
Look, it's a complex question, really, because, the garment industry has provided employment to many hundreds of thousands of millions, really, of Asian workers, So there's something to be grateful for in that. But at the same time, the garment industry hasn't been attentive to the conditions in which these workers work, This is especially true of Bangladesh, where we've seen time and time again these terrible factory collapses. Also, there is all kinds of mistreatment of workers that's happening across Asia. So yes, I do think fair trade, in as much as fair trade also takes social justice issues into account, it's a very important movement. And I think it should be very much a part of the way in which we look towards fashion going forward. But, most of all, I think what we really have to think about is this disposability aspect of fashion, because, fashion should be, whatever they do, they should place more emphasis on value, on lastingness and on value. It can't go on like this.
In Italy, we have this movement called slow food. I don't know if you are aware
I'm
of it.
part of it.
Yeah. It has becoming mainstream. Let's say, Do you think that shows that when things are well described, well narrated, depicted, people then understand and find this little effort to find special food, to pay a little more in things could be, could be spreading out. It could become not only a fashion, could become like a mainstream.
I think slow food has been incredibly successful, and really the slow food movement has been talking about acceleration for a long, long time, and it identified acceleration as the major problem, and I think they were absolutely right. So absolutely, there should be a sense of, paying attention to value. I remember when I was a child, actually to this day, when I go to buy clothes for my mother and my sister, every year we have these rituals where we give them, where you give your close relatives, female relatives, saris, and that is such a wonderful process. You go back to the shop 3 or 4 times, you take down hundreds of saris and you look at them, you learn about who made them, where they were made, how they were made. And it becomes a process of, it adds value. It adds value not just to what you buy, but to your life. It adds pleasure. There's a subtle pleasure, which I think Italians understand very well. This subtle pleasure that you take in the buying of objects that you prize. And we have to go back to that, we have to stop, just buying things online all the time as though they didn't matter. I mean, I see now, young people just don't understand. They don't understand this subtle pleasure. That these things add so much to the texture of life.
You mean when you say about when you said young people, I mean, are they anthropologically different from us because of the technological world in which they have been growing with?
Yes, I would say absolutely. Absolutely. I think the technological world that they've been growing in is a dematerialized world. It's completely dematerialized. I mean, you see things on a screen. The physical existence of that thing doesn't really matter. Really, young people have entered into a space which is kind of, it's non-material, it's virtual in a sense, and it has the strangest effects on them. I spent some time in Italy some years ago interviewing, the rifugiati who've crossed the Mediterranean in boats, because many of them are actually from my part of the world. Many of them are from South Asia, and a very large number are Bengali,
Yeah.
So I went around meeting them, interviewing them and so on. And I often would ask them, weren't you afraid of getting into this boat? Weren't you afraid of the risk? And, I really had the sense that, that they didn't appreciate the risk because they felt that their lives are now lived virtually through the phone. The phone has become this kind of incredible insulation between us and the real world.
And why actually were you asking questions to them? I mean, is part of your new project or something?
Well, a lot of it went into my book, Gun Island, which you read.
At the time, I see.
Yes, because there's a lot, the book is very much about movement, about refugees, about, the displacements that we are going through. So I wanted to learn about it at first hand, and I wanted to know what these experiences were. And I'm very glad that I did do this, do this research, I could say, because I think what is actually happening is really very different from what is presented to us in the media.
I see. Yeah, media again. Yes, that's sometimes we change a bit. When we edit reality, sometimes comes up. Distortion. I want to ask you something about if you are. I mean, here in Europe, we have discovered when the pandemic was raging, the sense of community, not only in Italy but as a European. All of a sudden, Europe was not only that boring institution which was there in Brussels and in Strasbourg, and sometimes was taking care of very boring matters, but became something which was protecting us as a let's say main hat, And Europe is working hard. It seems to me, in terms of changing its policy. Right now, there is a huge policy let's say, policymakers are in fact inventing, let's say, reinventing a development which will be much more on social issue and environmental issue. I mean, do you think this is a good proof that things could be, I mean, we could slightly be optimistic about the future?
Well, that's several several important issues. Look, I think in Europe, you're lucky that you still do have a sense of community. And that's certainly true of Italy. You know, I mean, I've seen everywhere in the world when two Italians meet, they have so much in common, they have so many things to talk about. There is that sense of commonality, which is why Italians were able to deal with this pandemic really as effectively as they have. Because all Italians wore masks when they went out, all of them respected this the lockdown. There was a stage when people were not even allowed to go out for a walk.
Yes.
You know? And similarly, in Spain, there was a stage where even children were not allowed to go out, and people respected it. Here in America, it's been completely different. You know, Americans, I mean, the lockdowns here are laughable compared to what's happened in Europe. You know, I mean, in New York City, the parks were full all the time, right from the beginning. I would notice all the time, many people were without masks. And especially now, as you know, a huge sort of culture war has erupted around masks. And I think this is actually the real problem here, that, you know, the inequalities are so great that they've led to a breakdown of a sense of community. You know, that's essentially what has happened here. There's a breakdown in the social contract. People are not acting in terms of the general good, and that is what this disaster is founded upon. I mean, you know, basically the pandemic in the US is a disaster, the worst possible disaster, and it's this disaster that arises out of inequality. Now, on the other question, I think you're right. I mean, Europe has long been taking the lead in a certain sense in bringing these issues of, the climate problem to the fore. Yeah. But look, at the end of the day, what has actually happened is that the European response has really been to ship the emissions overseas. You know, they've stopped emitting as much, but what they're actually doing is consuming embodied emissions, as they're called, from other countries. So they've just basically shifted the emissions and the pollution, etc., to other countries. But also, they've done things that are worse, you know. I mean, like Italy has been dumping nuclear waste off the coast of Somalia, you know. And that's one of the reasons why you have a breakdown in the fishing industry there. And, you know, that's led to these piracy and all these other issues. These things are so closely interconnected now. See, the first thing that Europe must do is shut down its consumption of palm oil. This is one of the greatest disasters affecting the world today. You know,
consumption of, sorry, I missed the word.
Palm oil, you know.
Palm oil, yes.
How do you say that in Italian?
Olio di palma, olio di palma.
Olio di palma, yes. That is, I mean, just look at what's happening in Indonesia, in Papua New Guinea. I mean, just entire tracts of primary forests disappearing every day. I mean, you know, we all hope that this pandemic will lead to something good, but in fact, it's leading to an acceleration of the disaster. You know, the Brazilian government seized this opportunity. In fact, a minister, the environment minister of Brazil, actually said at the start of this pandemic that let's seize this opportunity and take down all the regulations surrounding the Amazon. The Amazon, the deforestation rate has absolutely soared, you know. And once again, it's the indigenous people who are dying at a completely astronomical rate. Yeah. You know, the Amazon holds the world's fate in its balance. And beyond a certain point, deforestation will cause it to tip over, you know, into a different kind of ecology altogether, a kind of degraded savanna ecosystem. And there, you know, I mean, it's the world's greatest carbon sink at this moment. So, you know, as the Amazon goes, so do the rest of us. And we're just facing this utter disaster in Brazil. Yeah. Brazil is the single greatest problem, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to ask you something about the palm oil, because you mentioned as one of the one of the things which creates huge impact. In Italy we have products. I don't know if in the States it's the same. We have the palm oil has become all of a sudden a mainstream issue for the general audience. I mean, everybody's talking about it, and when you buy biscuits, there will be written on top without palm oil. Means that it's a marketing tool. It's becoming a marketing tool. And the reason why is that the fact that people were aware not only of the environmental issues, but also of let's say, some health issues related to it. So my question is, do we have to be selfish when we are citizens of the world? I mean, we usually are quite selfish. I mean, is the selfishness something which we should encourage and say, look, don't do this because it's mattering not only your environmental, which is something which is virtual in a way, but your home or your health or the children's health and things like that. Could be an issue?
No, absolutely. Look, I think Italians and Europeans generally pay attention to some of these issues much more than, say, Americans or Canadians or Australians or anything.
Why is that?
Here, there is no awareness of the palm oil issue. No one pays attention. There is no labeling. There is none of that, So I'm very glad to hear that, it's become such a major issue in Italy. It's certainly not here, nor do I think it's much of an issue in most of the world, But yes, absolutely, we must pay attention to these issues. The problem at this point is that the solution to these things no longer really lies with the West. It's really the enormous expansion of markets in Asia that is crucial. Until Asians start to pay more attention to these issues, there's there's not going to be any major change. I mean, Italians can't really change the world anymore. There was a time when the West was the sole home of solutions for climate, but that's not the case anymore.
What's happening in Bangladesh concerning the pandemic? Is something which is I'm not aware about of any. I didn't get any special news about Bangladesh, about the pandemic and the coronavirus. Is something which is under control right now over there?
I can't answer that in any detail, but I have the sense that Bangladesh has generally become very much better at handling crises than it used to be. Bangladesh is now, as you know, the fastest growing economy in South Asia. It has the best life indicators in South Asia, the best life expectancy, the best medical care. On many, many indices, Bangladesh is the best performer, So I would imagine that things have been much better in Bangladesh than in other parts of South Asia. Because in India, it's been an absolute catastrophe. A catastrophe on a scale that is literally indescribable, And it's a catastrophe most of all because it's a policy-created catastrophe. India responded very late to the pandemic, and when it did, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, what he did was that he imposed this draconian lockdown on the 24th of March, and the lockdown shut down all the transportation systems. So these people, this governing elite, clearly did not know that there are millions and millions of migrant workers within India, within the big cities like Mumbai, like Delhi, and all along the West Coast and in the South. Suddenly, these migrant workers, many of whom live very precarious lives, earning daily wages and having no other system of support, often not even having a roof over their heads, suddenly they were stuck in place. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't get any food. They couldn't do anything. So, they started walking home, an utter disaster, I'm sure you've spent time in Pakistan. I know that you've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, so I imagine you've also spent time in Pakistan.
Yes.
It's Pakistan again, an absolute disaster, and created by leaders who've done incredibly stupid things, and said incredibly stupid things, So what can you say? I mean, what we are seeing unfolding, especially in India and in Pakistan, is just a horror show, you know.
Yeah. And is this let's say weakness of leadership clear to the audiences which are related with? I mean, are the Indians, or let's say, or in Brazil, people aware of it, in your opinion?
In Brazil, definitely. There seems to be a general awareness now that didn't exist before. In the United States as well, there's a clear change in opinion. You know, you can see that the tide of opinion has changed, that people are beginning to realize, you know, what a disaster this is, because now it's the Trump states that are being affected. It's the Republican states that are being affected disproportionately. And, you know, the disaster there has been again created by leaders who refuse to mandate the wearing of masks or lockdowns. So yes, there has been a change here. But in India, no. That's the extraordinary thing. You know, in India, there doesn't seem to have been any kind of rethinking of the disaster that's happened. And partly that's because in India, we have a very ineffective opposition, you know. So for India, this has been a perfect storm, it's come at the worst possible time in the worst possible way. And I can't even tell you, perfect storm isn't even a metaphor, you know. In the early stages of the pandemic, in May, you know, suddenly one day I wake up and find that there's a cyclone heading towards my hometown, you know, Kolkata. You know, this was at a time when hundreds of thousands of migrant workers were walking back to Bengal, because Bengal is one of the poorest parts of India. So, you know, a lot of the migrant workers are in fact Bengali or from other parts of eastern India. And then suddenly they were hit by we were hit by a cyclone, you know. So again, you know, what we see now is that the ways in which catastrophes are interacting with each other, that is what is truly worrying and completely, you know, shocking in a way.
Going back to the book which we mentioned earlier, the goddess represented by nature is telling us, let's say, the merchant, the people which lives in the contemporary world, something. I mean, is that could we say that?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, I suppose you know, what she's trying to say is that you know, you are facing a disaster and you have to deal with it. You know, and really, you know, this knowledge of the disaster that's upon us has existed for a long time, but it's, you know, it's the modern age that has made us forget it. You know, I always think of Fukushima. You know, Fukushima, that area is very prone to tsunamis. And once, I think it was in the 15th or 16th centuries, it was hit by a tsunami. And the Japanese who were living there at that time put up a plaque on the mountain saying, "Do not build below this line." And what do the modern Japanese do? They go there and build the nuclear reactor. You know?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. Yes, I think we might have some question. I don't know. I've forgotten to ask if somebody wants to raise a hand or ask questions. If yes, I think there might be let's say an issue on with raising hand. If not, I will continue. You said that Bangladesh is, I mean, you mentioned the fact that it's a very fast growing economy. Do you think the building up the, let's say, the wealth of the nation, let's say, the Bangladeshi are also becoming more environmental sensitive, or the, let's say, the economic growth is out of the nature ecological system?
That's a very interesting and complicated question.
Sorry.
See, Bangladeshis are very well informed about climate change. The Bangladeshi government is one of the few in the world that actually makes an effort to teach its citizens about climate change. The government does this. There are many non-governmental organizations that do it. So even if you, I'm sure wherever you are in Tuscany, if you go to Arezzo, you'll find some Bangladeshis in the market, you know, running shops or whatever. Just talk to them about climate change. You'll see that they're very well informed about climate change. You know, and at the same time, Bangladesh has a very deep penetration of the internet. This is something that Westerners often don't realize, that actually the penetration of the internet through handheld devices is much deeper in Africa and Asia than it is in the Western world. So they're often extremely well informed about things that are going on in the world, you know. You know, that also creates all kinds of peculiar sorts of movements. You know, Bangladesh, despite having a thriving economy, is still producing very large numbers of migrants. You know, so I think the whole question of migration is complicated in this particular way, that it's not just the correlation between poverty and migration, or climate disaster and migration is very clear in some places. For example, in the Sahel, in Eritrea, and so on. But for other places, it's not quite so clear. You know, I mean, it's a much more complex phenomenon. At the end of the day, a lot of the migration is ultimately driven by acceleration. You know, by the acceleration of information, by the acceleration of modes of transport. All of these things are, they don't cause each other, but they are cognate. The pandemic, migration, increasing migration, climate change, they're all effects of this acceleration.
Yeah, but if, going back to the very first you know, theme which we developed in our conversation, culture and the way of narration. When you say acceleration, I can imagine in my let's say in my media means something nice. Acceleration is still something positive. I mean, why we have not been able to get the understanding of acceleration could be a very dangerous thing sometimes.
I know.
Why is that?
That's a very curious thing. But again, you know, a movement like the slow food movement has been so important in pointing to the dangers of acceleration, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
And again, you know, I think that's really what we have to think about. Slow food, slow fashion, slow travel, you know, all of those things we have to start winding down.
We are quite on the edge of ending our very interesting conversation, Amitav. I want to ask you, what is your next project? What are you working on? I'm so curious about it.
I don't know how to. It's a very strange thing. In March, I started working on a book which is, you know, a kind of deep history of the climate crisis. But it has now become two things interconnected. It's really about the planetary crisis, you know. So it's about the pandemic, it's about climate change, and it's about the deep histories of these phenomena and of the acceleration that we're living through.
Yeah, and it will be a feature.
No, it's nonfiction.
Nonfiction. Yes. Great. So Amitav Ghosh, I'm very glad to have met you even from far away. What I want to say is that I'm very glad that you know I know you know very well our country, but next time you should really come to visit us again. Maybe here in Tuscany, it's an open invitation to you.
Thank you so much, Duilio. Thank you.
We have a very interesting story right here, which is the Canale Mastro della Val di Chiana, which is an interesting story because it was drawn and imagined by Leonardo da Vinci in order to create a better balance between Tiber and Arno, the river which goes to Florence. So there is a history of land and water even here in Tuscany, which
of course. I mean, Milan is built on a huge floodplain.
Yes.
And I'm sure we have many friends in common. I'm sure you know Marina Forti, for example.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes. Yes, great, yeah. So I just wanted to remind our viewers that your books are published in Italy. All of them are translated, and they are quite successful, and they are Neri Pozza, I think.
Yes.
The latest published house, which is so. If you need to know more about Amitav Ghosh and his world, it's just there in the bookshelf everywhere in Italy. So Amitav, thank you very much, and please come to visit us very soon. We will be glad to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Duilio. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.